G'day everyone and welcome to the School of Political Science and International Studies podcast series here at the University of Queensland. This is where we bring you the analysis of the key events shaping the world and today. I'm Brian and I'll be our host, and joining me is Associate Professor Sarah Percy, Deputy Director of the Graduate Centre in Governance and International Affairs.
Hi Brian.
Associate Professor Marianne Hanson, Reader in International Relations at the School of Political Science and International Studies.
Hi Brian, hello.
And Professor Tim Dunne, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Hello Brian.
And today we're going to be discussing the Brexit. So, the Brexit, it actually happened. So thoughts, good, bad?
Personally, I think it's disastrous, and I think the events of the past few days have demonstrated the immediate level of disaster. I think the big question in the future is what the long-term impact is going to be, and to what extent the UK can pull back from the brink that it has found itself in and come out with some sort of viable solution.
Yeah, I'm in the disaster camp too, unfortunately. I think that nobody really had any idea that the vote to leave would generate and leverage such fundamental impact upon not just the European order, but arguably the global order as well. So, a majority of 4 or 5% for leaving has actually not only damaged the European Union, potentially fatally. This is the third biggest big hit that the European Union's had in a matter of a few years. It's fatally damaged the union of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. Scotland is almost certainly going to reignite the devolution mood and push for a devolution vote. Northern Ireland might even end up being reunified with all of Ireland. So essentially, and not only have we lost the British Prime Minister, we're likely to lose the leader of the opposition, or we could possibly. So this is quite incredible that a single vote about Britain and Europe should end up with such catastrophic and transformative change in a very short period of time.
Yes, it's almost astounding that this has happened. But before we move on to the Brexit in general, and we'll have some really interesting questions on that, so we do have to ask, since this was a non-binding resolution, and there is a petition that at the time of recording is almost at 4 million signatures long, asking for a referendum do-over, is this an absolute guarantee that the UK will leave the EU? Is there any way out of that at this point?
I think there are two ways out, but if I was in the Bet365 studio, or whatever they do in a Bet365 place, I don't think my money would be on this vote not being honoured. But I do think there are two possibilities for the regret people out there. And for me, the first is really the mobilisation from above and below. So the British state and the British leadership get put under considerable pressure, both by people voting 4 million plus. That 4 million needs to get to 8, 9, 10 million. So we need that to come through. And I think also some pressure possibly from other leading European states to say, look, do you realise the implications of where you're heading with this? So that's one way in which we could pull back from the brink. At least that's how I see it. But the second way, which I think is more likely, which I don't see being discussed very widely, in fact I've not seen it being discussed at all, inside the Conservative Party, there is one scenario that could mean we pull back from exiting, Britain pulls back from exiting from Europe, and that's if Cameron is succeeded by a Remain Prime Minister. Now, the Remain Prime Minister would have to defeat, of course, Boris Johnson, who's the most obvious candidate, because, of course, the exit camp won. But if there was a sensible, modernising, sort of business-focused leader like Cameron succeeding the current Prime Minister, then there is a possibility that person might call a general election and might say, we're not having another vote on Europe, but by the way, this is where I stand on the exit vote. I want to go back and negotiate a new deal with the European Union, and I'm putting, as part of my mandate, as it were, I'm putting out there the fact that we need to reconsider this particular issue, but we're not going to have a second vote. And if that new leader was returned with a significant and positive result, I think they could argue in Parliament that there is a way in which we might think twice about the decision that the people think they've made.
So there's a way to democratically say the people have spoken, even though the people have spoken.
Well, I think it's worthwhile taking a step back to see what the two main options are on the table now. And I think Tim's reluctance in thinking that these are unlikely options to materialize is right, but I think it's worth going through what they are. And then I think it's also worth briefly discussing the weird situation with the UK Constitution and what that means for referenda in general. So in terms of the two positions that are on the table, one position is there could be a second referendum, and the other position is somehow there could be an election, and as Tim's just said, the election result might alter the situation. So on the second referendum, I think as much as people might like to have one, I think it's very unlikely. Cameron's already signalled that he wouldn't call for a second referendum. And not only is it unlikely, I'm not sure it's a good idea. I mean, my instinct is, as much as I think the result has been disastrous, if a lot of the vote seems to have been motivated by a sense of alienation from democratic processes, and to immediately overturn a whole bunch of people who are feeling alienated in their votes by calling a second vote seems to me to be a bit worrying. And I think the other thing about the petition, which is a bit worrying, is if the result had gone the other way, people would be up in arms. If Leave had lost by a margin of 4% and suddenly announced that they didn't feel that the result was fair, I think that would get very short shrift as a matter of hearing. So I think it's a complicated thing.
Actually, it came out today that the person who set up the petition actually was a person who wanted to vote for Leave, and he set it up when it looked like Britain was going to remain, so he put that into play, and then all of a sudden it's been jumped upon by the other teams, which is an interesting turn of events.
And then the other option on the table is to have some sort of alteration in parliamentary politics which would lead to a return vote of some kind. And Tim's outlined one scenario. There are a couple of other scenarios. The difficulty is there has to be an election, and it's hard to imagine the scenarios which would lead to an election. So you could have a no confidence vote in the existing government. You could have the replacement of David Cameron by somebody who is a Remain campaigner. So neither of those, I think the first of those options is pretty unlikely, the referendum option. I think the election option is less unlikely, but still, I agree, if I were a betting person, I wouldn't be putting money on it's happening. I think it is worth talking about the constitutional background, because I think that's quite important. So, of course, the UK doesn't have a written constitution, which means, unlike countries like Australia, there are no rules written down about what to do in the event of a referendum. So, referendum in the Australian context has to have passed in all states and territories. There's no such proviso within the UK. So the position legally is not 100% clear as to what you do with the results of the referendum, and it's one of the consequences of having an unwritten constitution.
So with that regard, at the moment, David Cameron has announced that he will be stepping down at some point in the future, and also he's not going to be the one that's going to press that Article 50 button. He's going to leave that to his predecessor, so that's a wonderful welcome present. But at the moment, in the Labour Party as well, the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is also facing mounting pressure from within his own party to resign. So we're likely to see a major shift in both the Conservative and Labour governments. So with that in mind, what's the future for the UK Parliament when it comes back to sit in it, when that is soon?
Can I just make a comment about the position of Corbyn? Because that has been one of the cries lately, well, Corbyn didn't do enough. But I think we have to evaluate that a little bit more rather than take that at face value. He actually did campaign quite significantly. The UK press, which, as we know, was scurrilously leaning towards the Leave campaign with its sloganeering, etc. I mean, there seems to have been a concerted campaign not to report what Corbyn was doing, or if it was reported, to basically write him off. And this has happened with many of the other issues that he's spoken up about, not just the EU issue. So I think that it's probably too soon to say, well, Corbyn did nothing or did not do enough, he's out of the picture. I think we need to examine that a little bit more. And I wouldn't be surprised if he does manage to stay on, although it does look very tenuous at the moment.
I mean, I'm inclined to respectfully disagree with Marianne on that one, partly on the basis that there's been a few investigative reports that have not come from the mainstream UK press, so from people like Politico, talking about what for example, Corbyn refusing to do any Remain campaign events with Cameron, even though that was a strategy which had worked very successfully in the Scottish referendum. Corbyn personally refusing to provide the Remain campaign with Labour Party databases about likely voters, even though the Labour Party is a predominantly pro-Remain camp. So I think we do have some evidence that he was lukewarm in his campaigning. I think there's very little doubt that the mainstream press in the UK has a massive dislike of Corbyn. In terms of whether or not he can stay on in power, what are we up to? 20 different members of the shadow cabinet and junior ministers have now stepped down. And as opposed to maybe taking a concrete leadership decision, he's just reappointing more people into those positions. And I mean, personally, I don't think that is the exercise of effective political leadership. I think by the time you have, certainly in the Australian system, by the time you have over 20 people openly stepping away from your leadership in your parliamentary party, you've got a serious problem which is not going to be resolved by reappointing people to the shadow cabinet.
I think there's also a dimension to this which is not about Corbyn the person or the press's reporting of Corbyn the person. It's actually that the strong left, or even hard left as it's often described in the UK, the hard left has always strongly been pro-sovereignty. And it sees actually the sovereign state, or their version of the sovereign state, as being a really strong barrier to some of the neoliberal globalisation processes and transformation that's underway. And so in that sense, I think Corbyn, one of the reasons why he's lukewarm is not simply because he doesn't want to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cameron, but I think he actually occupies part of the political, ideological landscape, which is aligned actually with sovereignty, as opposed to aligned with multi-level governance.
Yeah. With this sort of exit from the EU, while we've been talking a lot about the UK, and obviously this affects the UK, it doesn't just affect the UK. In fact, the ramifications for the stock market have been global, but this has big ramifications for the EU. So we have Marianne Le Pen and Geert Wilders in France and Netherlands, respectively, arguing that those countries need to reaffirm their votes, and they should have a referendum as well. So are we seeing the end of this big European project? Or can the EU claw back from this third major strike in so many years?
I don't think that this means the end of the EU project by any means. I don't think so. I think it's much more resilient than that. Mind you, I said that Britain would never leave, so it just goes to show you can't believe everything that your lecturers say. I think the thing with the EU, there is disaffection, clearly. There is a sense of alienation. But I think that the leaders of the other member states will be very careful about suggesting a referendum. I think even if Marine Le Pen and others say, well, we want to do the same thing, I doubt that those governments would actually agree. And in fact, we have to remember that in politics, calling a referendum, it's relatively rare in most of the liberal democracies. I know in some it isn't. And on an issue as profound as this, right, membership of the EU, I think there'd be a lot of thought put into whether it was going to be allowed, the timing of it. I mean, the timing of this couldn't be worse with the coming on the sort of heels of the recession and the migrant crisis, which many of the exit supporters believe, is the fault of the EU. I mean, Britain is going to see continued attempts by refugees and asylum seekers to come to Britain. That's not something that leaving the EU can actually fix, so to speak. But I think the greater point here is that calling a referendum is a very momentous issue. The timing is important, the question is important, and as Sarah noted, very often in a referendum there will need to be specific conditions met. Something as momentous as this should require, in my view, a 2/3 majority rather than a simple majority, for example. Or it may need to be approved by Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, as well as England.
And that's one of the big critiques of the vote, is that it was a simple yes, no,
no.
with no conditions. And that's really rare when we look at examples like Canada had a number of referendums on this sort of thing.
The UK, I think, and this Brexit referendum is almost a perfect storm of bad conditions leading, which has built up to this vote. So, I mean, there's the simple fact of the matter, which I think is very important to point out, that there was no need to call this referendum in the first place, and that this was a deal that David Cameron had cooked up to appease some Eurosceptic backbenchers. And if you look at the polling data prior to 2013, it's not even in the top 10, the European Union is not even in the top 10 concerns of most of the British electorate prior to this past year. So the referendum whipped up a bunch of questions. As we've said, there's no constitutional discussion about how to deal with a referendum in the UK context. And the UK has had very limited experience of referendums. And the most recent one was the Scottish referendum. And I actually think Cameron was a bit cocky and overconfident on the experience of that referendum, which was quite close, that they knew what they were doing and they were going to do it again. As a Canadian, I find referenda extremely interesting, because really the only thing that stopped repeat referenda on the Quebec question in Canada was an act passed by Parliament on the basis of a test reference case that was sent to the Canadian Supreme Court, which said what would actually be required for Quebec to secede from Canada. And they set out a bunch of tests about percentage of vote, percentage of turnout, etc., and made the consequences extremely clear. And since that act has been, it's called the Clarity Act, set out, we've seen a diminution of referenda in Canada. The tricky thing about referendums, though, is they tend not to settle questions. So I think that the Scottish question is an example of this. I think we probably would have seen a Scottish referendum anyway, even if the Remain vote had succeeded. I think that is now almost a certainty. I heard polling data today that something like 60% of Scottish people are now pro-independence, which is the highest I think it has been ever.
Can I just come in on that? Because I think I'd want to push the sceptical argument quite a long way on this. I really don't see, and this is going to make me sound very undemocratic, my colleagues will shudder to hear this, but I really don't see necessarily that there is any way that a question about the future membership of a union is a question that's going to actually get the right answer. And that's not the right answer being my answer, but I think that essentially you don't really ask people about the boundaries of a political community, because of course we just don't know where the limits of the community are. And this is precisely why Woodrow Wilson's national self-determination, many diplomats were horrified by that idea, because they asked a very sensible question. Well, who is the community that's going to decide who is going to be self-determining? And this is a classic case that you've got fractured communities from Scotland, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, England, the rest of Europe, are all fractured along different aspects of the European experience and the European project. The idea that you can encapsulate in one moment in time a good answer to the question, are we European or not? Absolutely, we're not getting that, which is why we're now finding out that Google's been asked by a squillion times about what is Europe, what is the EU for. We're having people saying, well, I didn't realise, I thought it was all about sending migrants home. The Scots no doubt had in mind the possibility of a second referendum on devolution. This is going to happen. This is politics. And this is why the UK has a parliamentary sovereign model. It doesn't have a popular sovereign model. It has a parliamentary sovereign model. And it's the will of Parliament that should decide the future direction of the British state, and whether that's in Europe or out of Europe. And one hopes that the MPs elected to Westminster have the capacity to better perhaps understand some of those issues and vote on those issues in ways that are kind of with a little bit more foresight and clarity than actually some of the debate we've seen over the European project in Britain.
I'm really glad Tim brought that up, actually, because I think it's a very important question for any students who are listening about thinking about the nature and type of different democratic systems. Because, of course, on the one hand, referenda seem like they're these really democratic exercises, but with one important exception is there's no accountability in referenda. You can't generally change your mind, which is something we've already talked about. So unlike in a parliamentary representative democracy, where if you don't like the decision that's been taken, you can hold your member accountable for that decision by not voting them the next election. These are one-off decisions, and people make them quickly and often without understanding the full complexity of what's going on. And I think that's exactly what we've had here, is that we have here a result which is technically democratic in that people voted for it, but not at all accountable, and doesn't actually reflect the full population. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, which I think we should, is the very strong demographic interpretation of the results, where young people voted overwhelmingly to Remain. and what that does for the UK polity in general and how we control for that.
Yes, because that's one of the key issues when we look at the demographics. Under 25, I believe it was above 70%. Under 50, it was above 50%, and then progressively lower from there. And that signals for a lot of people that the old guard, which in many cases some people have uncharitably that they're going to be dead soon, but they've determined our future. So how does that sort of demographic divide really affect how the UK moves forward from this point?
Well, I think this is one among many signifiers, really, of an opening generational kind of gap on many questions, and polling data suggests around the environment, around in a sense inequality. There are quite strong gaps opening up that you can map on to sort of generational lines. And I have to say, I do feel, as a parent, and I do feel very much that the opportunities that I would have wanted my children to have had we still kind of lived in Britain and been part of the European project, I would have wanted them to have the opportunities that our generation and others have had, which is to be a student in Denmark and don't pay international fees. It was to go and work in Italy or work in Spain, choose to live there, choose to marry there, whichever. It didn't really matter because it said on your passport that you're part of Europe, you're part of the European Union. And that, as Andrew Linklater rightly argued many years ago, has been the single most transformative change in the nature of political community from Westphalia to the present. And it's a relatively recent change. And for the next generation, the young generation of British students, that opportunity is now gone, and I think that's really regrettable.
And that's actually, I think, in some ways, the story that needed to be told during the campaign that wasn't told. One of the difficulties is during the campaign that the focus was all on the economic loss, which, as we've seen, was people were correct to be worried about this. But in terms of telling a story that was going to get votes moving in the Remain direction, I'm not sure telling those scare stories worked. And what would have worked is actually telling stories about people feeling European, and people feeling part of a project and working as a reasonable counterbalance. At least it maybe would have worked better than what we've seen, which I don't think was particularly effective. Because I don't think there were very many voices who were speaking passionately about being European and about being part of this project. And it's hard to run that argument in the UK because, of course, not everybody agrees. But I think one of the things which the generational data shows is that actually younger people who had grown up, the generation which had grown up since 1975, always having Europe, is the generation which was the most likely to support remaining because they do see themselves as a European generation.
But it's generational, but it's also more than that, because of course this is a question about identity. And as someone who spent the first 45 years of my life in Britain, the one positive narrative there was about identity in Britain was the Europeanisation of the UK. It was the one thing the Welsh, the Scots, the English, the Northern Irish could actually agree on, that being part of Europe solved some of those historical anxieties and difficulties, and not least it gave a different generation of Britons a different narrative from the whole fall and great power narrative, which of course was the post-1945 narrative. And so I see this as a real big blow, actually, not just to the EU as such, but to the relationship between Britain and Europe. And there's no doubt that Britain became an important European power. It still can be, even outside the EU, but it's going to be an awful lot more difficult.
And with these sort of issues, I think it leads to, as I think everyone can agree, the UK has had a pretty bad week when we look at things. The rating agency S&P downgraded Britain's credit rating today from AAA to AA. The UK pound is at its lowest level in 30 years. They even lost the football to Iceland today.
Hang on, you made an important. You've made a mistake with the national question right there. You said Britain had a bad week.
England.
Wales have had a brilliant week. They're in the quarterfinals of the European Championship. So there you go.
But that actually leads us to the good thing. This next question, and there's been a lot of talk from Scotland, which was always going to be the case, that Scotland was very pro-Europe, so they were going to be very upset, and the data shows that. But we're also seeing the question reopen up about Northern Ireland, which is really quite interesting. So, are we actually seeing the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Yes.
Quite possibly. Can I just say something about the identity issue. Now, I grew up in Asia and Australia, even though I was born in the UK. And the first time that I went to live in England, I should say, not Britain, the immediate sense I got was that the English did not, for the most part, regard themselves as European. Europe was over there, over the water. And I think that that is a fundamental thing that hasn't really gone away. Perhaps for the younger generation it has been, it has changed. But I do think that if you compare it to, say, the German experience, the Spanish experience, so many factors within England suggest that psychologically there is a gap, a big gap between themselves and what they regard as Europe, the continent, rather than themselves being in Europe.
But you see, I think that's where the generational change is so significant, is that you have a generation of people who were all born post-1975, who have done things like lots of high school exchanges in Europe, Erasmus exchanges, studying at other European universities, working and living, marriage, population mobility. All of these things mean that the generation that saw the continent as abroad and somewhere where you went on holiday and called it the continent. I don't think that generation. I think that generation. I think you're exactly right, and that's part of the reason why we see that cleavage. I think the continent is abroad and they have funny foreign food. Generation is more naturally Eurosceptic than a generation that grew up with being part of the European project being normal.
I mean, an interesting indicator of this is that every single vice chancellor in the UK of UK universities co-signed a letter saying that to withdraw from the European Union would, in a sense, be the wrong choice for the UK. Every single one of them. It wasn't a 70-30%. It was every single one of them. Now, okay, maybe they've got some interest in the current system, but I think what was partly motivating what they're saying is that they had the hearts and minds of the young people who are populating those universities, and they know that their future is a European future rather than a British past. And I think that was really admirable that they took that position. But just coming back to, if we can, just for a moment, the implications for the European Union. The Scotland one, people have discussed, and I think Scotland will take its opportunity, and that's a good thing for Scotland. The Northern Ireland one, I think, is really interesting. And rather than think about and speculate about whether there could be a united Ireland, and that's certainly a possibility, I think part of the narrative, to go back to a point Sarah made, part of the narrative which was not told and not heard in this campaign was that if you look at the academic literature on Northern Ireland, what solved the troubles, such that they are solved, what solved the troubles was the process of Europeanisation, because it meant it wasn't just about London and Belfast and Dublin, it was also about Brussels, it was also about France, it was also about the United States. It essentially put the problem onto a different onto a different plane, and that enabled the parties to sit down without so much of that bilateral history, which made those relations toxic since at least the 1960s, if not going much further back. So I think we shouldn't underestimate, and this is always a story that Europeanists like Marianne will tell everybody that wants to listen to them, is that the European project was essentially a project about making people safe and secure. It did that in Northern Ireland, and if you take that away, I worry a little bit about the consequences of in a sense, making that a British problem again.
Yeah. And one of the things that it's also important to stress is that the British political system, it's highly centralised. There's no written constitution, as has already been discussed, and there are, I think, plenty of people, particularly at the margins and particularly in these regions, who feel a sense of grievance against London, against Westminster. And in this, for them, the idea of Europe has been fantastic for the most part. It really has.
Although, of course, many of those regions voted in massive majorities.
I'm thinking of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales to some extent as well.
Yeah.
Yes, that the identification with Europe is stronger there, almost as a vote against, the hegemonic sense that Westminster represents.
And one of the interesting things that once we got the polling data, the voting data, is that those regions of the UK which were more heavily dependent on EU funds were actually the regions that were most likely to vote for leaving. So is this a UK issue, like the campaign was bad, or is this just a case of the EU not actually promoting what they're doing?
It's enormously complex, and I find it really interesting because my UK ancestry, which has given me my UK passport and allowed me to work in the UK for so long, is all from Tyneside. So that's the area around Newcastle, which was very economically depressed with the collapse of the shipbuilding industry through the 70s and early 80s. And whenever we used to go visit my granny, which was quite a lot, you would see all these European Union funded projects. And if you look at the economy of that region, there's a massive Nissan factory in Sunderland, and they are able to trade with Europe without paying export controls. The future of that factory is in significant jeopardy. There are lots of problems, and one of the things which I think is extremely interesting is why people who are net economic beneficiaries, without the European Union, there would be many fewer jobs on Tyneside than there are now. And what the opinion polling data suggests coming from those areas is that this is a situation where people were not voting about the European Union at all. And if they were voting about things like, will I get paid less now because there are tradesmen that have come from Eastern Europe and my hourly rate is less. But very little engagement with the European question. And I think I think if you can't sell Europe in those areas, I think it also shows some serious failings on the part of the Remain campaigners.
Okay, and thank you very much, everyone. This is a deeply complex issue, and I think we've barely scratched the surface of it. And unfortunately, I think this is going to be one of those issues that we will be returning to over and over again as we find out just how the UK and the EU are going to separate or not. So thank you very much for the panels, and thank you very much for listening, and good day.